Chapter 13. The Secret. Colin was right about Sebastian being angry at Jonathan. He showed his anger after dinner in the flickering light of a dozen candles scattered throughout the dining room. Sebastian swallowed a final bite of a shortbread and wiped the corners of his mouth, then stood up. He banged his metal plate on the table to get everyone's attention. "All right, in the morning we'll have to meet the mailboat again. You ready for that, Gerald?" Gerald burped and nodded. "Good. You can all drag your mattresses wherever, even in here if you want." The boys looked around. It was a big room with plenty of floor space, but it was also a little close to the freezer. "Now," Sebastian continued, "it's time to refill the coal furnace. We need 2 people. How about," his voice trailed off as he scanned the room, "Colin. And let's see." His dark eyes glittered in the candlelight and flashed to Jonathan. He smiled. "Johnny. Oh, wait, you don't like fire, right?" Jonathan's eyes dropped to the floor. He rubbed his hands on his sleeves. "Well, sorry. Everyone has to take a turn. Be sure to refill it real full." Sebastian grabbed a candle and stalked away with Benny and some others at his heels. They disappeared out the door that led up to the grown-ups' bedrooms. Colin sighed and looked at Jonathan. "Well," he said, "I guess we should just go and get it over with. It's not that bad." Jonathan nodded. "Yeah, okay, let's do it." The furnace was in a room beneath the kitchen, down a steep, short staircase. The room was hot and muggy and smelled like a wet ashtray. The ceiling was so low Jonathan could have jumped and touched it. It, too, was made of stone blocks, held together with crumbling mortar and forming a steep arch, so that it curved down to meet the floor at both side walls. The furnace was a black iron monster the size of a car, squatting in the far darkness. It hissed and hummed and rumbled. The rest of the room was filled with waist-high heaps of lumpy black coal. A little trail wound between the coal piles to the furnace. "That's a lot of coal," Jonathan said. "Yeah," Colin answered, hanging his lantern from a hook on the ceiling. "Coal delivery day is the worst. 3 hours of wheelbarrow work, and for every little lump you drop, you get a minute in the thinner sorrow. I dropped 10 last time. Ouch." They walked to where a couple of shovels were leaning against a wheelbarrow. They each grabbed one and started scooping coal into the wheelbarrow. The scraping of their shovels echoed on the low stone ceiling. Black dust from the coal sifted up, and soon they were both coughing and clearing their throats as they shoveled. "What was really there?" Colin asked between breaths. "At the hatch." "Just a door," Jonathan panted back. "I told you." Colin shook his head. "You're keeping something. A secret." Jonathan stopped and leaned on his shovel. "How do you know that?" Jonathan shrugged and kept on shoveling. "I watch closely and listen. Almost no one else does that. And I can tell you didn't tell everything." Jonathan sighed and scraped another shovelful of coal into the wheelbarrow. "You're good," he admitted, then told Colin about the sounds and the skull and the strange ancient-looking door with the spinning handle. He didn't mention, though, the other staircase, or the librarian. "A skull. That's so weird. It's like a warning. Or a threat." He dropped his shovel and grabbed the handles of the full wheelbarrow. Maneuvering through the coal piles, he rolled it up to the growling furnace. Jonathan followed cautiously behind him. At the furnace, Colin stepped forward and turned a few rusty bolts, then swung open a thick metal door. A blast of heat rippled out into the room. Jonathan took a step back and covered his face with one arm. He squinted out from under his elbow. Inside the furnace was a burning hell of flames and fire, glowing in shifting hues of red and orange and blazing white. He couldn't look at it without narrowing his eyes to slits. The heat made the air waver and ripple. Colin turned and saw Jonathan backing away. He blinked and then swung the furnace door mostly closed. "You're scared," he said, and Jonathan looked away. "Why?" Jonathan just shook his head. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down his face. "You can trust me." Colin said. His voice was soft but insistent. Jonathan nodded and swallowed a ball of fear. "Something happened," he said, his voice shaky. "To me." "What?" Jonathan took 2 steps forward and undid the buttons on the sleeves of his shirt. One after the other, he pulled his sleeves up to his elbows and held out his arms to Colin. Colin's coal-smeared face looked closer to see. The lantern swung from its hook above them, making shadows writhe and twist around them. His eyebrows rose into the beads of sweat on his forehead. His mouth rounded in surprise. He reached out and ran his fingers softly over the twisted grooves etched in Jonathan's skin. He brushed his fingernails gingerly over the toughened swirls of hard scar tissue that covered Jonathan's arms all the way from his wrists until they disappeared into his bunched-up sleeves. Jonathan's hands were shaking. With a gasp, he pulled back suddenly and tugged his sleeves back down to cover his tortured arms. I don't like to show people, he stammered, desperately fumbling with his sleeve buttons. I don't like to see them myself, he added more quietly. Colin grabbed Jonathan's trembling hands and held them still. Then he gently buttoned up the first of Jonathan's sleeves. "They're burns," he whispered. "Were you caught in a fire?" "No." Jonathan shook his head. Tears sprang to his eyes and he looked away. "I was not in the fire." Colin finished buttoning the second sleeve and looked up at Jonathan with eyes that were quiet and wide. He was watching closely and listening. When did this happen?" Jonathan took a ragged breath. "A while back," he answered. "What happened?" Jonathan ground his teeth together. He blinked and shook his head. "We should finish the coal." "Okay, sir." Colin turned and reopened the furnace door, the small, suffocating room once again filled with heat and angry light. Colin pushed the wheelbarrow right up to the furnace's open red mouth. "It's okay," he called back over his shoulder. "I think I can do it myself." He grabbed both handles of the wheelbarrow and struggled to tilt it up into the furnace. He grunted, and his feet slid and slipped on the coal-dusted floor. Jonathan shook his head and winced. He watched Colin wrestling with the heavy wheelbarrow. His arms were crossed, the fingers of each hand rubbing through his sleeves as the burns in his arms. Colin looked so small, so helpless by the burning fire, so in need of help. Jonathan stepped forward, shoulder to shoulder with Colin, and took hold of one of the handles. Together they lifted it and dumped the load of coal into the waiting flames. There was a shower of sparks and a fresh wave of heat. Jonathan's arms burned. They let the wheelbarrow drop, and Colin slammed the furnace door. The boys stood panting, leaning on the wheelbarrow. Their hands were black, and sweat dripped muddy trails through the coal on their faces. "Well," Jonathan said, pulling at his shirt where it stuck to the sweat on his body, "that wasn't so bad." "Yeah," Colin responded between coughs. "That was one. Takes 5 to fill it." Walter and Jonathan and Colin pulled their mattresses into a corner of the dining room by the kitchen, away from the windows to the courtyard, which let in moonlight and cold draughts and memories of lightning. Other groups of boys had their mattresses together in clumps, too, here and there around the room. No one wanted to sleep alone. They laid their mattresses like spokes on a wheel so their heads could be together. They'd each carried a candle when they'd gone together to the old sleeping quarters to claim their beds, and when they lay down, they put the 3 candles together on the floor in the space between them. Their faces were smooth in the candlelight, their hair dark with cold blackness all around. Walter lay on his stomach, watching the candle flames. Colin was on his elbows, quietly folding more paper animals. Jonathan opened the book the librarian had given him. The pages were yellow and fragile, and they whispered in the quiet of the room when he turned them. "What book is that?" Walter asked. Jonathan turned back to the cover. "Robinson Crusoe," Jonathan read, "by Daniel Defoe." "I've heard of that," Colin said. "Is it any good?" Walter asked. Jonathan shrugged. "I haven't started it yet." "Could you?" "I was going to." "No, man, I mean, like, out loud?" "Oh, yeah, I guess if you want." He licked his lips and cleared his throat and paged back to the first line. "I was born in the year 1632, in the city of York, of a good family, though not of that country, my father being a foreigner of Bremen, who settled first at Hull," Jonathan began. Reading was hard in the dim, flickering light. He followed the words he read with a fingertip. "York? Like New York?" Walter asked. No, I think it means York in England, Colin explained. Oh. Jonathan continued. He got a good estate by merchandise, and leaving off his trade lived afterward at York, from whence he had married my mother, whose relations were named Robinson, a very good family in that country, and from whom I was called Robinson Kreuznauer. I don't get it, Walter complained. It's an old book, Jonathan said. It's written all kind of old-fashioned. Nothing important has happened yet, though, I don't think. Oh, okay. And stop interrupting. Okay. But by the usual corruption of words in England, we are now called, nay, we call ourselves and write our name Crusoe, and so my companions always called me. What is that? A voice asked over Jonathan's shoulder. He craned his neck to see Miguel standing in the shadows, the candlelight playing on his curious face. Just a book, Robinson Crusoe. You gonna read that whole thing? I don't know, I'm gonna start at least. Huh. Miguel stood in the darkness and hugged his shivering body. Do you, want to listen? Jonathan asked. No, Miguel answered quickly. But, whatever, I'll go grab my mattress. A moment later, Miguel reappeared with another boy, both dragging their mattresses behind them. Walter and Jonathan and Colin spread theirs apart to make room. I'll start over, Jonathan said when everyone was settled in. He got a good estate by merchandise, and leaving off his trade, lived afterward at York, from whence he had married my mother. Can I listen too? Tony stood just outside the circle of light, a pillow under his arm. And me, another voice asked. Jonathan looked up and saw David standing there. Sure. The boys already there made room in the circle for 2 more. Soon there were 7 heads facing one another through the flames. I'll start over, Jonathan said again with a sigh. And he did, with 6 pairs of ears listening to his whispered words. They all listened together to the story of a man trapped on an island, far from his family. The story held them together like the light from their candles, warm and close against the dark stone and shadows. But out in the darkness that surrounded them there was a scurrying of rats, and above them, he knew, Sebastian slept with a sharp sword in the admiral's bed, and below them the hungry menace knocked at an ancient door. And even then, surrounded by friendly faces, his dark fears whispered at him, and the flickering warmth of their candle's light seemed terribly small and fragile.